Okay, morning everyone. Thanks for having me along to be one of the first speakers on this Doug conference. I guess Keith was concerned I wasn't going to plug my book hard enough, so I thought rather than put the title slide, which is looking at was concerning the data science of London's visualising London's big data and data science, I thought I'd just put the cover of the book up instead. I took the second reference to it out, the cover at least, part way through the slides. So I thought it might be quite interesting for you to see some of the visualizations that I've done, particularly focused on London, and specifically for this book that was published almost a year ago, and run through, I guess, some of the logic and rationale behind why we selected London to do such a book, where we got some of the data from, some of the processes that went behind the graphics that we produced. And in terms of the kind of general aims of this day, in looking at influencing and so on, this is actually very hard for me to quantify in terms of the work that I do, because I put graphics and visualizations out there, but then they just kind of disappear. And every now and then you'll get an email from someone saying, oh, I'm using this for a school project, or I'm taking this along to my staff meeting next week to demonstrate visualization, and so on and so forth. So I very rarely get to see the impacts of this work in a very sort of tangible way. I only have the satisfaction or otherwise of Amazon reviews to go on. So London, of course, is home to many data visualization pioneers, and in a sense the city itself is kind of immersed in great design, Beck's tube map, for example. And I guess there are a number of pioneers really that we're all about at the same time, kind of Victorian England, that are worth highlighting. So this guy, or these were produced by William Farr, who was actually one of the pioneers of statistical data collection. And one of his big areas of study was the cholera outbreaks that were occurring during the sort of mid-18th century. And he's been slightly overlooked by someone else, who I'm going to come on to in a second. But his course of kind of studying cholera and trying to quantify the causes of it really led him to formalized and rigorous data collection. Unfortunately, his theory was completely wrong, which was that cholera was an airborne disease. He thought that the smell was the problem rather than the water. And essentially, because the smell got worse in the summer, he was keen to show the relationship between temperature, essentially, and deaths from cholera. And these kind of rose diagrams are a kind of really interesting way of showing that. I won't go into detail, but the black shadows are a number of cholera deaths, and then you've got the kind of temperature and climatic information running in the middle. So where the red is thickest, second from the left on the bottom, you can see that that's where most of the deaths were, and really that was the kind of one of the fundamental documents he put forward to argue for this cholera as an airborne kind of smell-based disease. Now, as I said, he was he's now somewhat overlooked by Jon Snow, and this is an example of one of Jon Snow's maps. It seems he made several, and I encourage you all to look at the Wellcome Collections image library. They've got hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of free-to-use maps and graphics that were produced about this time. And Jon Snow actually was one of these great Victorian polymaths, pioneer of anaesthetic, amongst many other things, but determining the source of cholera, I think, was a small side project he had, where he went door to door trying to ascertain the number of people that had died in Soho from cholera, and representing each death by a single black bar. So most of these were, you can see them sort of parallel to the street. A few he's had to flip over because certain areas had many deaths. And he was also keen to dispel myths. So The grey box on there was apparently it says it's a site of a former cemetery or something that I think, again, people were blaming or having something to do with it, but he was disputing that being the issue. But essentially, because he added geography, he added spatial data into the mix, he was able to ascertain that essentially the people that were dying from cholera were using a specific well in Soho, and of course that's now become depending on what discipline you're in, he's the father of epidemiology, spatial analysis, geography, geoscience, whatever. But essentially a very simple idea nowadays, a routine demonstration of the power of spatial analysis. It was able to confirm and enforce the cause of one of the major kind of diseases in Victorian London. And then, of course, the final pioneer, I guess, I'd like to highlight is one probably well known to most people in this room, particularly those that win the Doug Award, is the Charles Booth poverty maps. And again, Booth's day job was not statistical data collection. He was into rubber. He took rubber to South America and was a very big rubber plantation owner, I think, and again developed car tyres or cart tyres and so on, and made his fortune that way. But it meant he was put in charge of a charitable foundation designed to give money to London's poor. And I can't remember the statistic, but he was told that, 10% of people in London were living in poverty. And he actually thought that was a massively inflated number. He didn't believe them. And so in order to best apportion the funds, he actually set about doing his own comprehensive survey. And he did that by knocking on doors, asking school masters and police officers to give their views. And of course, the vicious and semi-criminal category is not one that we could use today, but it's one that marked out London as very poorest, and they were in the dark colours. Ignore the City of London, he didn't survey that. And then red, and then where we are today, the yellow areas are the most affluent. So the results of Booth's study was actually that poverty in London was much greater than the 10%. And of course the geographic patterns he established for the differences between wealth and poverty in the city have remained relatively unchanged over the last 100 years, and arguably I think this remains one of the most detailed surveys undertaken, or at least one of the detailed visualizations of a survey undertaken, because conventional statistical disclosure controls would mean that you would never be able to show individual household information in this particular way. And we were keen actually to show how relatively unchanged some of these geographic patterns have been by overlaying the index of multiple deprivation on top of the Booth map, and again kind of demonstrating how the east-west splits of London, as I say, until recent years have been a fairly persistent geographic pattern in the city. So starting out on this book, and what you'll hear today is about how we're probably leading the way. Visualization is a very exciting and progressing area of, I guess, research, and as well as sort of working in the commercial sector. But we're still aspiring really to some of these early pioneers. I don't think even conventional technology can match some of the work that was put in. Even 50 or so years ago, we have really detailed census atlases of London produced. This thing is these maps are about this big, and it was a census atlas produced by Emrys Jones and others from LSE. But what has changed is that it took something like 8 years or 9 years. I think this was published in 1968 or 69 from the 1960 census. So it took them that long to get the data processed and then to manually produce these kinds of maps and graphics. And what I also find interesting is that the narrative of these things hasn't changed much either. So if we look at a book published in 1964, you'll see that they are emphasising, I guess, the value of big data in a way. Such differences in social composition could only be fully revealed if we had comprehensive data for small, homogeneous urban areas of the kinds which will in fact become available for the first time in the census of 1961. We're still saying that today about, conventional output areas and so on. So this guy, Westergaard, actually produced this geodemographic classification of London. You can see the size of the areas here, where he had different inner working class zones, middle class zones, and then sort of West End and Hampstead and so on. But interestingly, his book was produced in 1964. Well, this chapter was produced in 1964. He's using the 1950 census for his classification here. So where things have changed, I think, is definitely the expediency in the data collection. And I guess in our book, we were able to produce graphics from data that were released the same day. And even today, I don't know what we're 2015, so we started the book in 2013, so it was only 3 years after the census was produced, and even then we were running a bit late. We could have started a bit earlier because the census outputs came out sooner. But it's not just the census. We've got many other data sources too. So there's the Open Data Institute that have really been pioneering and pushing open data through the likes of the data.gov.uk website, which doesn't just cover things like the census, but it covers administrative data as well. And you'll hear actually a lot more about the data portal that we've just launched after the break. We also have Ordnance Survey data. Making Ordnance Survey data open made the book possible, frankly, because the licensing requirements of some of the base mapping that we had would have been so prohibitive given the size and the volume of the books that we were printing. It just wouldn't have been possible without OS open data. And then the depth and the quality of the information from the ONS, thanks to the census. And then also things like freedom of information requests. So we were able to put a freedom of information request in about the flight or the operational behaviour of the Metropolitan Police helicopter. We were asking them where they were going and what they were doing. I asked the exact flight paths, but they wouldn't give me that. But they did give me the location and purpose of the call. And that's up there on What Do They Know, so anyone else can take a look. And some of the graphics we made private requests for. For example, we've got data from Lovestruck looking at dating preferences for people in London. So taking all these data sets, we were trying to kind of form a general structure around the book. And we came up with a very loose one, which is where we are, so things about London as a place generally, who we are, which is, I guess, the bulk of the census information. Where we go, which is something I probably won't touch much on, but this is based on the wealth of data now available from Transport for London, the Greater London Authority, and so on about travel behaviours. How we're doing is some of the stuff about mortality, poverty, childhood obesity, and so on, that are things that London could do a bit better, I guess. And then what we like was kind of just a general and everything else category that we couldn't necessarily place some of the other graphics in. So I guess I'm up here as a big data expert, so-called, and a visualization guru, but I'm afraid to say that a lot of this book is just hard graft and manual work. So there was an awful lot of computing behind it, and I'll talk to you about that as well. But independently, the computational power and data mining techniques is no good without some kind of manual intervention for many of these visualizations. So here we are, we're plotting these books on the table are the black cab drivers' knowledge training manuals, so that the routes they have to learn to become a black cab driver, and we actually compared those routes to sat-nav routes. So because it's kind of, everyone thinks you get in a black cab in London and suddenly you're weaving in and out of all these streets. And that is because the drivers are told to go as straight a line as possible between point A and point B. Whereas if you get in an Uber or a mini cab, they'll be following a sat-nav, which generally prefers kind of straight roads. So this is a story that I think will run and run and run because, there's always this tension between black cabs versus Uber. This graphic combines both. This is millions and millions and millions of data points collected from real-time locations of shipping in the Thames estuary. So we went right out into the North Sea, all the way up to the end of the tidal Thames. And on top of that, much of this bathymetry data, so that the seabed and so on, is not actually open data. So to get the context to this graphic, to get the geography in there, I actually had to manually tweak some stuff, and there's lots of wind farms and so on out there that weren't in there. So really this combination of manual intervention with large-scale data sets is one of the things that we were keen to enforce really in our process, because that's, I guess, how you add some of the intuitiveness and meaning to some of the graphics. So just running through some of the data sets, this is a nice traditional one using traditional data from the census, and it's looking at the ethnic composition of people in London and really kind of showing kind of the patchwork of the different groups there, from Asian, Black, Arab, other groups, white and mixed groupings. And we were keen to show this in a positive and impartial light. I'm sure if Theresa May was using this in her conference speech yesterday, we'd be adding a lot more red and fractured communities and so on, based on what she was saying about overwhelming migration. Whereas I think we were trying to be, I guess, impartial and let the numbers speak for themselves. And things like the colour palettes and everything that you use in these sorts of graphics and representations are really important. Moving on to, and I was, we've done stuff in the past where we've had BNP conspiracy theorists saying that the Labour Party are importing West Africans to vote for them, which will then cause East London to be the centre of the UK Ebola outbreak. That was one of my favourite forum discussions featuring our work, but this has yet to be picked up by those guys. But one thing that was extremely controversial was our football map, which showed where the largest body of support was using Twitter data for each of London's football teams. So red here is Arsenal, dark blue is Chelsea, and then lighter blue is Fulham, yellow is Crystal Palace, and so on. So it's the team colours. And essentially we gridded London into lots of small squares, and we counted the number of tweets using each team hashtag from each of those squares. And then whoever tweets the most, or whichever team gets the most counts of the hashtag, then they get the colour on the map. Now, I don't remember who wins. It's either Chelsea or Arsenal. Either way, people were not happy with this, generally. But I don't care about football. I don't mind winding up football fans. So in this case, we're happy for a bit of controversy to surround the map. I think Chelsea probably just about win. And actually, in this case, the geographic distribution may not be that surprising. Of course, the home team football grounds are the largest areas of each body of support, I guess. But and actually, we were keen to show areas where we didn't have data as well. So you'll note that there's white on this map, and it's because we set a threshold value. So only a certain number of, if only a square needed a certain number of tweets before we coloured it on this map to avoid. We could have actually kind of interpolated the whole map and coloured everything in. I think perhaps the most controversial graphic in terms of how we process big data and do data analysis is this one. And it's tracking people around the world based on where they've tweeted from. So if you've got your geolocation switched on Twitter, we can extract that information, and then we can see where you're tweeting from. And if your bulk of your tweets are in London, we assume you're a Londoner, and then we can see the parts of the world that people from London are tweeting for. And it's a very interesting proxy for mobility. So for example, there's lots of Africa comes out where there aren't direct flights from London, but obviously where there's kind of lots of people from those parts of the world living there or visiting relatives and so on. And then, of course, some of the big connections come out, so Australia and New York and so on and so forth. And why I say this is slightly controversial is because I think there's still some debate to be had about the the elements of consent around it. You know, if you're sending a geolocated tweet, are people aware that this stuff can be used, and so on and so forth. I think that this is relatively harmless because there's no specific information about individuals on here, certainly, and we're at the global scale here, and there's a lot of aggregation. So, you know, there's no way you can extract anything personal from this. But in other cases, you can. And you start to get paranoid, actually, because last week I was in Windsor, and I went onto Facebook today, or yesterday, and Savills were advertising properties for me to buy in Windsor. So you just think, is that just coincidence, or are you starting to get paranoid about all this geolocation data being used? So I think there's, again, I don't have any particular concerns about it, but I think there's certainly an educational element to this and how people deal with their personal data. So just for the last few slides, really, I was just going to run through, you know, kind of before and after shots, really, because before being how the graphics looked when I produced them using R software or conventional GIS software, and then the after shots is how they looked when they went into the book. And the person I haven't mentioned here is my co-author, who's Oliver Uberti, and he was one of the senior graphics editors at National Geographic. So he is a graphic designer. He knows a lot about data and has done a lot of work with data. And but without, again, his input, there's no way that I could have produced kind of a book and some of these visuals. So I mentioned a data set that we actually produced a graphic for on the day. This is the travel to work flows data that came out on the day that we had to submit the book. And I'd written an R script to produce the visualization on the top, which basically draws lines between the origins and the destinations in the census data. We were able to use the 2001 data to kind of produce our initial graphic as kind of a draft, which then meant that we were able to get our labeling and everything sorted for the final graphic, which falls underneath. On the day, the data came out, I was able to press go on the script. It generated this in like 5 minutes or less, and then we could just slot it in to this particular graphic. I mean, these things could not have been done manually, certainly, and they couldn't have been done without kind of like a decent amount of computing power and data awareness and so on. It's also interesting to see how, you know, you can piece together graphics to produce something a bit more cohesive. So this, for those of you that did maybe even GCSE geography, basically a population pyramid tipped on its side in the top left. That's how it kind of looked when I exported it from R. And then we had a map here which showed, I don't know, in this case I think it's probably the distribution of people who are married in London on the top right. And then we basically pieced them together, changed the colours and so on to get the final graphic. Of course, what happened in reality was when people in the media got hold of it, they then cut it up again. So you see they cropped out individual maps and so on. And interestingly, this one for me was probably the least exciting in terms of visual forms. You know, it's essentially a choropleth map with a population pyramid. But I think this has probably been the most popular online of all the graphics we've done. I think because it conveys a simple message that basically London is a young city, lots of single people live there. As soon as they get married, they move out. That's the kind of three headlines from that. And again, it's a nice, interesting demonstration of how perhaps predictable we are in terms of our life behaviours. But again, nothing too complicated there, but it became a very powerful graphic. And then some of the work that we've done was very kind of manual in a way. We were just trawling through some relatively sparse data and trying to think of interesting ways of visualizing it. So the ONS, I think, are a bit more they've done a bit more on this now, but this was a lifestyle, self-reported life satisfaction survey, looking at people's sense of purpose, their anxiety, and so on at borough level. And relatively sparse data in terms of its level of geographic aggregation, but also, you know, not massive sample sizes in this survey either. But we were keen to include it as an example of kind of where data are heading really in terms of national statistics, and there's some fun stories in there too. So we actually used this is Oliver's notes and scrawls. You can see he's drawn lots of smiley faces on here, because we actually used Chernoff faces for this one, where essentially we had different things. So the sun glow in the background is one variable through to kind of how many beads of sweat you have, shows how anxious you were. And we called this Islington Has Issues because Islington comes out very unhappily. I lived in Islington at the time, so I felt it was okay, to abuse your own borough. But it's, again, guys in Kensington, Chelsea seem pretty happy. But we added the UK average too, because London on balance seemed to be a bit less happy than the rest of the UK. And then the penultimate graphic is this one, which actually shows the importance of thinking creatively about different data sets. So in this case, and actually I saw headlines about this yesterday or the day before, this is using Food Standards Agency data, where they release all the data sets. I think they've even got an API now that looks at food hygiene scores. So you see these scores on the doors at restaurants. All that data is open data. And so what we were able to do was actually take it. We discarded the food hygiene stuff because actually most people are like 5-star, 4-star, or 1-star. There's not much variation across the piece in terms of across the piece in terms of the way that these things are quantified. But they do have the full names of the restaurant, bar and cafe and so on, and its category, and it's specifically its location. So we were able to actually map the names to their locations and then overlay the deprivation data to see what kinds of words appear in restaurants and cafes and bars in the poorest parts of London and the richest parts of London. And club and bar and so on and so forth, bistro and brasserie and so on are all in the rich parts, and then you end up with more things like grill, chicken, takeaway, fried, and so on and so forth on the right-hand side. And of course, the subtext to this is access to healthy food and so on and so if you, it's not showing a map, but it is showing is kind of the same message is being put across, that if you tend to live in poorer areas, you tend to have less access, more access to fast food and so on and so forth. And then I guess the final graphic I wanted to show is my favourite in terms of the value of kind of me as an academic data sciencey type person working with a designer, and it's using stuff from the Tate Collection. So the Tate have its entire inventory online, free to view, and it has contextual information about each of the artists as well. So you've got the artwork, and then you've got who information about the artwork, information about the artist. And we were thinking of ways of visualizing it, and almost as a kind of exploratory thing, I did a tree map. So each square here is an artist, and the size of the square is the number of pieces of art that each artist has in the collection. And I don't know how good your eyesight is. Does anyone know what the big square on the left is? Turner. So basically Turner put his whole everything, he went to the Tate. So they've got masses and masses and masses of stuff from him, which is kind of interesting. That's your headline really in terms of the graphic, but how to make it more interesting. And actually we thought these could be transformed into pictures. They could then be on a gallery wall. And we'd been to the I can never remember the place in Marylebone with the beginning with W, Wallace Collection. We'd been to the Wallace Collection. I don't know if any of you have been there. It's got a very good armoury, but they also have these massive salon-style galleries of paintings and so on. So taking that as inspiration, we converted these into pictures, and then we licensed a Tate image to put into the main box. And so you can see here, instantly there's a much bigger visual impact. You've got a much more interesting thing to look at, which is the Turner. And then while I think I was at a wedding, Oliver was busy pulling all these out from the wall so that the sculptures are on the floor and so on and so forth. So it's the same data, it's the same information, but hopefully it's in a slightly more immersive and engaging way. So that's me, and I've got time for questions?
Yeah.
So if anyone's got any questions, then fire away. Thanks very much. There's one at the back. Have we got microphone runners or just people who shout?
Hiya, Martin here from AXA PPP. Thanks very much for a great talk, and it's a great book as well, so I can thoroughly recommend it as a way of getting people engaged with data and trying to explain to my son what I try and do on a regular basis, but not half as good as you managed to do. My question is about the speed from which we actually collect the data to actually getting it out there to be used for something useful, to then impact policymakers and politicians to, again, develop their thinking rather than necessarily scaremongering. I was impressed when you said that you were sort of dropping in a graphic before the book went off, sort of arriving at and turning it all around in 24 hours. How fast do you think we should be looking at to actually get access to some of the data, say, from the ONS? And do you think there's sort of more inroads we should be putting the ONS under pressure to deliver that?
I think that's a good question. I mean, there's two thoughts that I've had about this. The first is, I think ONS are rightly cautious about being too quick. I mean, they can't win. I had this conversation with some of the ONS, and they always say that the example they give is the inflation figures, basically. They kind of give a preliminary inflation estimate, and then they spend a bit more time getting the right one. And they get bashed over the head for getting it wrong, and then they get bashed over the head for not doing it quickly enough, and so on. So for releasing it too early and all the rest of it. So I can see how they're in a bit of a bind, really, in terms of this tension between, very carefully collected and well-constrained data sets and getting it used. I actually think the flip side is actually how we as users deal with the data and behave with it. Because one of the things that with the kind of general media working with this book and other stuff I've been doing, they've got no appetite for uncertainty or thinking about uncertainty. And I'm sure that some of the people that you present your data analysis to, the Alan Sugars of this world, they've got no interest in uncertainty. They want to know a fixed answer, a definitive number. And one of the nice things about the book was that we had a bit more space to try and convey a bit of uncertainty in the information and the way that you visualize it. So I suppose the argument is if people are able to be a bit more responsible with data that are a bit rough around the edges, then I suspect then it will be less terrifying for some of the official statistics agencies and others to start releasing things that are a bit earlier than they would normally. Several, one at the front and two down there.
Am I going first? I've just got a question. I mean, I was looking at the title of the conference, and I was thinking about the visualizations that you showed. And I really loved the ugly visualization, the one that you concentrated on that was popular, which showed the number of single people in London and how that changed over time, and they move out and things. I thought it was a very powerful visualization. And I rather disliked the one with all those masses of circles about what people eat. Because I wondered why, really you just didn't give me a list on the left-hand side of what people eat in the richest areas, and on the right-hand side a list of what they eat in the poorest areas, and I could just compare them and see that they eat roast chicken in the richest ones. And I thought I would spend ages looking at all those little bubbles, but it would look lovely on my wall. So there was something going in my head about the fundamental question of the conference, and there was something I was trying to take from it, and that's my only thought.
I think, I suppose, what's my defensive response? My defensive response to the dinner plates actually was, firstly, there's a use of metaphor there that you certainly don't get with just a list. And then the second thing is that took hours and hours and hours to sort out. And the reason it took hours to sort out was because we were manually positioning each of those plates so that you could just scan from the left to the right, bar, cafe, brasserie, and so on and so forth. And you instantly got a sense of the magnitude of it from the size, and that your eye was just scanning across, and getting it shaped like that and everything is really hard to do. 2 lists would have been all over the place, because actually you wouldn't have just had the list, you would have had the number as well to try and work out. So it would have been like, cafe is at point 1, number 50, and then you've got to scan down to point 10 on the other list. I mean, we could have done a parallel plot which had lines crossing the 2, but then you lose the sense of metaphor and so on. And I mean, I suppose in the other point of defence, we are, to a certain extent, producing something that we do want to look nice on people's walls, because it is engaging. I would not have put that up at an academic conference, for example, or talking to specific stakeholders and so on. One more.
I wondered what your view was of the constraints that we face in data visualization. Is it, for example, imagination or insight or time or technology? What do you think is the greatest challenge?
Dimensionality. So I think we are very much constrained by print, but also liberated by print. Actually, I think one of the other key things that, this print and interactivity I think is important as well, but when you think about interactivity, it does give the option of adding extra dimensions in the data and showing some of the complexity. But then it does become very complicated, and I think there is a distinction between specialist users and kind of like the general public user. In terms of we very deliberately constrained ourselves to print. So we could have done an ebook, but we didn't want to do that because of the constraints that different screen sizes and stuff put on. And the nice thing about paper in this case was, stuff you don't really probably don't necessarily appreciate straight off, which is we spent ages getting the dimensions of the book to match the dimensions of London, so that every graphic we had was optimally placed on the page, and different levels of zoom and all that kind of stuff. But in a sense, and even down to the paper we used and all that stuff as well. But and the binding as well. It's endless iterations of things that I never even thought were things that you could decide in books, but you can. And in a sense, I mean, that took a long time, and it wasn't particularly interesting from the data analysis perspective, but it became very important at the end. So I think the final constraint is time, basically. There could be many great graphics out there if people just had an extra couple of days to think about the colours and the layouts and so on, without, and this comes back to the first question, without having to panic about getting stuff out there as quickly as possible.
Yeah. Can we hold the rest of the questions, because we're running a bit over time? Thank you very much.